Well, hello again and happy Monday. Today is lecture number 15. We're going to be talking about political institutions and economic institutions and the question of to what extent can good institutions foster stronger and more rapid development. So we're going to be looking at Hernando de Soto and in particular his advocacy of property rights and his view of property rights and the formalization of property rights as a key to helping the world's poor unlock wealth that they already hold and they already sit upon. And secondly, we'll be looking at James Robinson's view of Botswana. So Botswana as a truly exceptional outlier in terms of development within Sub-Saharan Africa, and how its development was achieved and the role that institutions have played in the relatively strong economic and political outcomes in Botswana. But before we begin, I have a few class announcements to get through. So as I indicated in an email that was circulated earlier today, section number 2 test, section test number 2, which was originally scheduled for Friday, has now been canceled. I know a lot of you are going to be upset about that, but that's just how it is. The grade distribution is going to be updated by the end of the day today, so keep an eye open for an updated syllabus. So I have your first round of policy briefs graded. You should be able to find your scores on Sakai. Email me if you would like a copy of your policy brief with my comments in the margins. And your midterm grades are going to be coming soon. I apologize for slacking off a bit on those. I'm aiming for getting those back to you by the end of the week at the latest. So again, I apologize for the backlog in terms of grading. I'm trying to do that as quickly and as effectively as possible. So let's start with institutions. Institutions being the focus of today's lecture. So when we talk about institutions in today's context, we're going to use the economic definition pioneered by Nobel Prize, offered by Nobel Prize laureate Douglas North. So institutions in this context refer to the humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. So in other words, the agreed upon rules of the game that structure communal relationships and communal interactions within a given society. So within this definition, we can think of two types of institutions, the first of which are formal institutions, which are publicly established and generally done so in writing, and they're formally enforced by the state, either through law or through some other type of regulatory intervention. So we can think of things like Congress, the Constitution, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, and formal entities like the police, and the formal infrastructure of society. By contrast, we can look at a more subtle but equally important form of institutionalization, that being informal institutions. So these are not codified, they're not written down anywhere, but they're still widely understood, acknowledged, and adhered to within a given society. So we can think of certain examples being embodied in societal taboos, customs, and traditions. So for instance, in much of the world, it's still customary for the bride's family to pay a dowry to the groom's family upon the occasion of their marriage. So that would be an uncodified but still quite strong and still quite widely acknowledged informal institution. So one of the individuals who's paid a lot of attention to institutions, and in particular formal institutions, and their potential for unlocking wealth among the world's poor is Peruvian economist and entrepreneur Hernando de Soto. So he is a huge proponent of formalizing the already existing informal commercial relationships that currently take place and are constituted and performed among the world's poor. So the idea here is by extending formal property rights in particular, we're going to be able to enable the world's poor to utilize the wealth that they already hold in their possession, to utilize things like their agrarian land, their farm equipment and the like, to be able to draw from property rights and not just possessions of these forms of wealth. And moreover, establishing a written paper trail in business transactions and formal transactions between different parties in a business arrangement, that helps to establish trust between potential business partners, and ideally will facilitate greater entrepreneurship and risk-taking among the world's poor, when at the very least you have that safety net of a paper trail. So if you're entering in a business transaction and for whatever reason the party you're doing that transaction fails to fulfill his end of the bargain, you can go to a paper trail, you can go to a contract to give yourself a little bit of protection in the event that there's not fulfillment or there's breach of contract on the part of the second party you're doing business with. And that at least will create more of a stable business environment and a stable landscape among individuals that are entering into business relationships. So I wanted to start by showing you a scene from one of my favorite films of all time, the 1983 crime drama Scarface. So as some of you will have seen the film, I would suggest watching it if you haven't already. But as some of you may already know, the film it centers upon a drug kingpin in the make, Tony Montana, who at this point is a recent immigrant to Miami from Cuba. So the scene that I'm showing you here and I've linked to in the episode description, it gets at, or it documents his very first drug deal, his very first deal as a newly minted or a newly established drug pusher in Miami. So here he is entering the household of an individual he doesn't know, he knows by reputation, and this leads to kind of a game of chicken and egg in which Tony is holding the money but doesn't want to show his hand to this individual who he doesn't know, and this individual claims to be holding the product that Tony wants to obtain through this transaction, and without any implicit or explicit third-party guarantee of this transaction, this transaction is taking place in an extra-legal underground economy. It becomes a very tricky arrangement and a very tricky dance for both parties. So this scene it's about 1.5 minutes long, and it just gets at how complicated and how strategic both parties have to act without an implicit guarantee that you and I will more or less take for granted living in a formal market economy and performing the bulk of our transactions within that economy. So this gets at the problem of trust in a market economy. Market capitalism, as a rule, works best in high-trust societies. So in societies where people are more likely to agree with the statement that most people can be trusted, that most people have good intentions, you can take most people at their words. The market economy is, in its nitty-gritty, it's a system of person-to-person exchange that is aggregated at a societal level. But at its basis, it's about you and I exchanging goods and services on a day-to-day basis. And in order for a market economy to function efficiently, it's often necessary for individuals to take one another at their word in transactions. So you probably don't remember the exact process of the last thing you paid for. So think back to the last item you ordered online, or the last time you went to a coffee shop to get a cup of coffee or an iced coffee or the like. You probably paid money before receiving the good. So that sequence was probably you pay, you wait, and then the vendor gives you that good. So in high trust societies, you're taking the vendor at his word that you can trust him at least for that minute or that minute and a half between when you've paid your money and you've received the good, to hold your money in trust and to exchange services and goods for the money that was rendered. So there's an implicit level of trust that takes place in every single transaction, almost every transaction that will occur in a market economy. So this is something that we almost take for granted on a daily basis, but it's really the bedrock of any kind of functioning market-oriented economy. But the big question is, where does trust come from? So a sad fact is that more homogenous societies, so societies where the bulk of people speak the same language and come from similar ethnic backgrounds. So looking at places like Scandinavia that have low levels of ethnic and linguistic diversity, those countries tend to have higher levels of trust. In the absence of sort of common kinship ties and common linguistic ties, a stand-in can be a process of documentation. So here in the United States, we can look at things like our social security numbers. So our social security numbers show that we can work legally here in the United States. Our credit scores, so our credit scores will show that we've borrowed money before, we've paid that money back, or at least we've paid installments of that money back. And we can look at things like our driver's license to provide proof that we are who we say we are, and provide an instant digital record of some of our behavior and some of our more important pieces of data about who we are and whether or not we're trustworthy. So these are material sources of identification subject to verification by a state or third party. So for the most part, it's the Commonwealth of Kentucky or the United States federal government that is going to verify this documentation. A scatter plot of countries that are plotted by medium income and levels of trust. So on the y-axis, the question is share of people agreeing with the statement, most people can be trusted. So unsurprisingly, a lot of the countries that score high on both dimensions are in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. So Norway, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland score very high, again, kind of getting at sort of the uncomfortable hypothesis that countries with somewhat less ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity tend to be more, have higher levels of trust, although there are some very important outliers. So the United States has a relatively high level of both, as does Canada. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but that is a general trajectory. And the countries that are clustered on the bottom of both axes tend to be based in the developing world. So again, there's a sort of clear, not completely linear, but clear positive association between levels of trust and how well the market economy works in a given country. So we talked about the market economy. We can think of this as the legal economy as well. De Soto estimates that about 5/6 of humanity lives outside of the legal system. So they're conducting economic transactions, their daily business, in either a gray market or a black market. So as was illustrated from the clip I showed you earlier of Scarface, it's much more difficult to do transactions that you and I more or less take for granted on a daily basis in these types of environment, because you rely on having to have complete trust on whomever you're doing business with, versus having any kind of recourse to go to a third party, to go to the Better Business Bureau or give a really bad Yelp review, or even go to the police for kind of a non-rendering of services for cash paid. So there's recourse that you have in the public, in the legal economy, that you do not in the extra-legal economy. So the bulk of this population is employed in what De Soto calls the informal sector. So for the most part, informal enterprises are small family-held operations. So think about small family farms, maybe small family textile or artisan businesses, and there's no formal accounting of business activities. So bookkeeping, if it is done, it's done in a very rudimentary way, or it's done completely off the books. So record keeping and documentation of these enterprises is either sporadic or non-existent. So De Soto sees this as a problem. He argues that a lack of trust and a lack of legal safeguards in place end up putting a hard cap on growth, which is why it's not surprising that you see a strong correlation between low-income countries and countries with low levels of trust. So holders of informal businesses in the informal sector, they will rarely employ people and hire people outside of their extended family networks because you can't trust strangers. You're putting too much faith in a stranger's hand if you hire that individual as an employee and that individual turns out to be less than trustworthy. There's no third party you can go to if you end up getting screwed over by that individual. So for that reason, there's a very limited ceiling placed on how much these enterprises can grow. And as such, they're generally unable to attain the division of labor necessary to generate wealth. So if you think of pretty much any Fortune 500 company, they'll have a human resources department, a legal department, an engineering department, and a number of different divisions. They're able to grow to a certain extent to the Fortune 500 level by identifying and creating effective divisions of labor, identifying and creating potential departments and streamlining production through specialization. So when you're solely working with people who you can trust in your extended family network, you don't have an opportunity to attain quite such a sophisticated and effective division of labor, which again places a very hard cap on the extent to which your enterprise can grow and develop and become profitable. So here is a map of the world. It's a little bit out of date. These are 2003 figures, but the estimated size of shadow economies as a percentage of GDP. So I've circled in red De Soto's home country of Peru. So at this point, more than 60% of Peru's total economic output was generated in black and gray markets in the shadow economy, in the informal sector. So it makes sense that De Soto, being from Peru himself, would want to address some of the current economic shortcomings and economic inefficiencies that are rife within the informal sector and within the shadow economy. So a really big concept to take away from today's lecture, probably the big concept, is the distinction that De Soto draws between possessions and property. So possessions are simply that. They're things that you currently have in your possession. Doesn't matter how you got them. So whether you purchased an item legally or you stole it or you obtained it through otherwise unlawful means, if it's in your possession, it still counts as a possession. So for the most part, for goods in your possession, there's only one function. If I have a pen in my possession that I possess but I do not legally own, I can use it to write, but that's about it. There's no secondary or ancillary function of that pen or of that item that I have in my possession but I do not own. By contrast, property is not only something that you have in your possession, but it's also, importantly, you have that possession plus documentation that indicates that you obtained that possession through legitimate means. So it's not just your house, it's the deed to your house. It's not just your car, it's the title to your car. It's not just your household appliances and accessories, it's the receipt showing that you legally purchased these household accessories. So property, as opposed to possessions, property serves a number of legitimate purposes unrelated to its intended function. So if you own a car, but you want to start a small business, but you don't at present have the capital to start a small business, you can go to a bank and put up your car as collateral and use that to obtain a loan to start a small business. You can use you can rent out your house. You can put your house on Airbnb to generate more income. You can sort of buy things on credit and then pay off your credit card bills to build up your credit rating. So there are a number of uses outside of the direct functional use that to which you can apply property that you cannot to which you cannot apply for merely things in your possession. So the shift from possessions to property is not merely a semantical one. It's a very important one in terms of how you are able to utilize things in your possession. And it gets at the heart of what De Soto prescribes and what he outlines for a number of different poor countries and poor communities. And finally, documentation of ownership, and specifically documentation when things change hands. So a deed on a car, a deed on the house, it creates a paper trail that facilitates trusts between consumers and sellers. There's a record of a transaction taking place. If there are any issues or irregularities that subsequently arise, by either the purchaser or the seller can go back to that record and use that record as documentation of the transaction having taken place. So that facilitates trust on both sides. So the big question here from De Soto's point of view is, how do you close the institutional gap that separates poor countries from rich ones? So for the most part, economic institutions, legal institutions, just day-to-day functions of business and accounting, they're all much more well institutionalized in affluent countries. There is a much more robust and extensive paper trail relating to day-to-day financial transactions in rich countries than there is in poor ones. So the big question here is, how can the world's poor win access to adequate property rights and legal safeguards? So De Soto here sees promise in the work of regional organizations and international organizations. So he looks at a number of common legal customs and accounting customs and customs of doing business that are agreed upon by the members of the European Union. This is called the Acquis Communautaire. So these are agreed upon regulations and principles that each of these countries acknowledges in doing business with one another. And he sees a very important agenda setting and norm establishing and diffusing role for international financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, or the World Bank. But the challenge here is to extend these regulations and these best practices in a way that's consistent with long-running indigenous practices and norms, in a way that's going to foster trust and take-up among the world's low-income population. So it's not enough to just unilaterally extend these institutions and these practices to these populations. It has to be done in a way where there's some continuity with the way things have previously been done, which might represent a precedent of hundreds to thousands of years. So it's important to reconcile, ongoing established best practices with what's been going on over a longer term in the informal realm in poor countries and poor communities. So big question is, can good institutions in themselves put a poor country on a path to prosperity? So individuals who would answer in the affirmative to the previous question would likely point to Botswana. So Botswana is a small country based in the heart of southern Africa, Sub Saharan Africa. So it has a population of about 2.5 million. A median income per capita of $18,000 per person, which is ranked number 5 in the continent and number 71 in the world. And within the continent, it has one of Africa's most stable political climates. It's held competitive elections consistently since the latter part of the 1960s, and it's been governed under democratic norms since then. So despite being small, Botswana is quite wealthy in terms of natural resources. In particular, diamonds are a massive boon to the national economy. Other major sectors include cattle ranching and tourism. So this is commonly, especially people that advocate a free market path to economic growth, they'll commonly point to Botswana as a least likely case scenario. So this is a country that's tucked away in the poorest part of the world that nevertheless, through a prudent establishment of market-oriented principles, has managed to attain and sustain relative economic prosperity through a period of decades. So Botswana is a lot of sort of more free market-oriented, free enterprise-oriented groups are very excited about Botswana and are very eager to use Botswana as an example for how to do development right. So I've included a clip here, a country case study of Botswana in the video description, so y'all can check that out. So here is a comparison between GDP per capita in Botswana versus the median GDP per capita in Sub-Saharan Africa. So as you can see, there's a stark difference between levels of growth and levels of wealth and wealth generation over time in Botswana versus the median of the continent. So Botswana is a very substantial and a very important outlier in this respect. So Botswana is also viewed by the standards of the region as a very clean place to do business. It's a place that's attractive, at least by regional standards, to international investment. So its 2019 rating from the Corruption Perceptions Index was 61 out of 100. So that's about akin. It's about the same number as it's comparable to Spain and Portugal. Spain, Portugal, Italy, Southern Europe have similar corruption perception ratings to Botswana. So that's about how Botswana is perceived internationally. So this is the second best rating in Africa, behind Seychelles, and number 34 in the world. So again, very, very strong performance across a number of different domains: economic performance, political stability, the transparency of the business environment. So Botswana, by the standards of Sub-Saharan Africa and even globally, is widely acknowledged as a good place to do business. So Botswana is number 5 in the continent in terms of its place on the Human Development Index, and currently, as of 2016-2017, had a rating of 0.71. So it's that little speck in the green just north of South Africa. So we'll get into why that's not why that should be even higher. So life expectancy is one of the areas where Botswana still lags behind even regional standards. We'll get into why that is very shortly. Sorry about that. So 20 of the world's 54 poorest countries are landlocked, whereas only 3 of the world's richest 35 countries are. So landlockedness, especially in the developing world, is a massive disadvantage, as it really cripples your ability to take part in international trade, especially when your internal transportation networks aren't that great, your roads, your rail system, your freight system, and the like. So despite that advantage, Botswana's done really well. So the big question here is, you basically couldn't identify a country that has more natural geographic circumstances working against it. Yet Botswana has nevertheless managed to attain and sustain relative economic success and very impressive levels of political stability and good governance. So what exactly is behind Botswana's success, and can it be replicated by other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa? So in one sense, it's quite a simple story. So thanks to economics, we know quite a bit about the policies that on paper are likely to foster growth, likely to foster higher levels of entrepreneurship and risk-taking, likely to foster better economic outcomes. So from our macroeconomics textbooks and research that's been done in economics and public policy, we have a good idea of what these policies look like. Naturally and accordingly, the types of economic policies that Botswana has put into place have consistently been in line with what Western economists and developmental agencies recommend. So you see an admirable amount of restraint in both spending and printing money, the cultivation of appropriate comparative advantages in the domains of diamond extraction and marketing, as well as ranching, and also the establishment of cordial trade relationships with neighboring countries. South Africa being a pivotal partner for Botswana, South Africa having one of the larger economies and one of the larger markets on the continent. So this is in a way a very kind of tidy and a very textbook story of moderation and adherence to economic best practices. So the type of recommendations that are doled out on a fairly regular basis by market-oriented economists and market-oriented international financial institutions. But the bigger and I think the more difficult question here is, why were circumstances such that political elites within Botswana elected to pursue good policies and elected to pursue policies that were in line with the public interest? So remember, we've talked about the kind of deadweight loss created by corruption in some of the world's poorest countries. The paradox of some of the world's richest people happen to be heads of government of poor countries, happen to be presidents of places like Angola and places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. So what was it in the case of Botswana in particular that led to an alignment of elite incentives and the general public interests? So Botswana, despite having a number of geographical disadvantages, it had a number of sort of coming out of colonization. It had a number of characteristics, internal characteristics, that gave it a better shot than most newly decolonized countries, specifically decolonized African countries. So when Botswana gained independence from Britain in the year 1966, it was fortunate to inherit borders that for the most part aligned with tribal identity. As many of you will know, one major driver of conflict in Sub-Saharan Africa since the end of colonization and sort of through the latter part of the 20th century through today is a misalignment of borders and national identities. That's created a lot of tribal strife and sectarian conflict within a number of different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So off the top of my head, the Hutu-Tutsi conflict in Rwanda through the 1990s would be a good example of this. But for the most part, Botswana's borders and the ethnic groups that comprise the newly independent nation of Botswana had a unified Tswana identity. So you had the bulk of Botswana at this point comprised of 8 affiliated tribes with similar internal governance structures and similar histories and lineages and a set of common symbols to unify around. One of which is the practice of the Gotla, or the Tribal Council, which was a sort of quasi and proto-democratic historical hub for decision-making, a body of deliberative decision-making. So the king was ultimately the sovereign in Botswana, but he was a sovereign by the grace of people, and there was some custom of decision-making on the basis of deliberation, if not total consensus, that it was a duty of the king to consult with his affiliates before he made that decision, or before he made decisions that would affect the community as a whole. And moreover, even sort of closer to the present, Botswana has been fortunate to have strong leadership at critical junctures, especially at the critical juncture of declaring independence. There were a number of very early and very prosperous investments made in the domains of education and infrastructure that have paid dividends and are continuing to pay dividends today. So there is a photo of the first Botswana president, Celeste Khama, who governed until shortly before his death in the year 1980. Another interesting alternative history is that in terms of natural resource wealth, sequence really matters here. So Botswana is a fantastically rich country in diamonds, but the bulk of that diamond wealth was not identified or not discovered until just a year after Botswana declared independence. So Botswana declares independence in 1966. At this point, it's one of the world's poorest countries. It's not until 1 year later in 1967 that a massive diamond reserve is found in the Arapa region of Botswana. So it's interesting to think about how differently things could have played out if Botswana's independence were delayed by just 1 year. If Botswana were already a known site of substantial diamond wealth by the time of its independence, how much would that have complicated the process of independence, and how much would Great Britain have still tried to maintain some type of sphere of influence over Botswana following independence? So I think that's a really interesting and open question as to what extent does the sequence of Botswana declares independence in 1966, 1 year later it finds its most massive haul of diamonds, to what extent does that sequence matter in terms of the trajectory of Botswana's overall economic development over the next 5 decades? So remember, earlier on we had the slide in which Botswana was shown to underperform slightly in the Human Development Index. This is largely because despite leading Africa in indicators like economic development, economic vitality, and education, Botswana, even by regional standards, has really struggled with HIV-AIDS. So as of 2016, about 1/5 to 1/4 of Botswana's adult population was living with AIDS. So a total number of 360,000 of a total population of 2.5 million. So this life expectancy figure is a little out of date. These are figures as of 2014, but at this period of time, the average life expectancy in Botswana was just 54 years, which even by regional standards was below the regional average. So as you can see, this is part of why Botswana has taken a hit in the Human Development Index, and sort of the continuing conundrum of HIV/AIDS in Botswana. It poses an interesting developmental question as to why is this the one very prominent outlier to what's otherwise been an unblemished record of success for Botswana. So as you can see, life expectancy in Botswana took a massive tumble towards the latter part of the 1980s when the AIDS pandemic really took off, and it has yet to recover either by global standards or by continental standards. So HIV/AIDS, even by the standards of a region that's struck by it and stricken very heavily by the pandemic, has hit Botswana especially hard, which presents a very interesting challenge to the general narrative we have of Botswana as an overwhelming success. But that's all I have for today's lecture. Again, I apologize for the delay in getting it out. I will get up the Botswana question on Moodle tomorrow. Please let me know if you have any questions about the lecture, or again, if you would like me to email you a copy of your policy brief with my comments. Thank you again for your time. Have a wonderful evening.